So when it came to this trench warfare, this is kind of what a lot of people think of when it comes to World War One. But it wasn't the only story going on. The people who were fighting in Europe were not the only people involved in this conflict. The conflict affected people from across the world. It affected people who were civilians, so people who weren't actually fighting in the actual like battles. They were affected too. So what we're going to be exploring today is what actually made World War One a truly worldwide war, not just the battles on like the actual battlefields, but how was everyone kind of affected by this? If you guys go to Moodle, there is a set of notes to kind of help us out with today. So you should open those up, and I will share the screen, and we're kind of go from there. There we go. But before we kind of get too deep, I just want to do like a quick check-in with everyone. So 1 through 5, how is everyone feeling today? So if you are in the class, if you want to just like use your fingers, that's fine. Those of you on Zoom, you can use your chat. So just kind of see like how's everyone kind of doing. Okay. Okay, cool. Okay. And in the chat, 3s and 4s. Okay. Yeah, it looks like we're mostly like, oh, oops. Mostly it looks like we're like 3s and 4s and a little bit above. And some people are a little bit lower, and that's okay. Yeah, so hopefully you guys' day gets a little bit better. It is a 3-day weekend, so hopefully that is going to be cool. So when we look at World War One, we often think of those battlefields, especially not just like in schools, but in our media. If you look into like World War One movies, for example, they're almost all exclusively about like the battlefields, European armies fighting each other. But there's a lot more to the story. And we're going to take some time today exploring a little bit beyond what is the traditional kind of retelling of history from World War One. Why is it important that we explore perspectives and stories outside of what kind of like the main kind of narrative is when it comes to history? Yeah, we really want to see different points of view. Everyone, even like outside of history, if there's just like events going on in your own personal lives, everyone might have different perspectives on what is happening. And that's kind of, honestly, that's kind of where a lot of like drama generally comes from, just different perspectives. But that still applies to history. We want to get different perspectives to get that full story, to understand what was going on, what were the thoughts and feelings and experiences that people were facing, especially people who sometimes aren't focused on in our stories about history, especially for things like World War One.
Like the more perspectives you have, the less bias is like put into the
Yeah, exactly. If you're oh sorry. Yeah, so if you're only hearing history from one perspective, you're not getting the full story. You're going to have a very biased interpretation of whatever event that was. So in order to try to get a true understanding of the past, we have to try to get as many perspectives as we can. So we're going to do a little bit of that today with World War One. There are 5 perspectives that we're going to be looking at. These are definitely not the only perspectives for World War One, especially not the only ones that are sometimes kind of left out of the story. But these are 5 that are really important. So the first one that we're going to be looking at is what is called the Senegalese tirailleurs. And for that second word there, it means sharpshooter in French. It's been a while since I've like spoken French, so I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I think I am. Oh, tirailleur, yeah. So yeah, tirailleur just means sharpshooter, and this is the story of Senegalese soldiers. So soldiers from Senegal, which is in Africa, as well as some other parts of Western Africa, who were also involved in the conflict. We're also going to be looking at the story of Vietnamese workers who were supplying a lot of the weapons that were needed for this war. We're also going to be looking at the experience of women. Even though this is a war that was mainly fought between like guys, women were really involved even in the combat. We're also going to be looking at the experience of Indian soldiers who were a huge part of this conflict, especially for the British side. And we're also going to be looking at something called the Arab Revolt of 1916. In addition to European battlefields, the second largest like area of the conflict was the Middle East. So we're going to be kind of exploring that a tiny bit today too. So the first perspective that we're going to be exploring is the Senegalese tirailleurs. And as we kind of just like looked at, these are soldiers who were mainly from Senegal, which is a country in Western Africa. And during this time period, France still controlled much of Western Africa. During the 1800s, France, England, Germany, all these other imperial powers, they decided to carve up the continent of Africa. They carved up Asia and some other places. And they basically were like, hey, this area is all controlled by France. This area is all controlled by England and so on. Yeah, it is actually. Yeah. And the area where Senegal is at happened to fall under the French territory during this like split up of Africa. And as the war started breaking out, it became pretty clear that the war was going to last a long time. So the French needed a lot more soldiers. And they started looking at their colonies as ways to bring more soldiers from those colonies to go fight in Europe. And one of the biggest places for this was Senegal and the areas around it. At this time period, because like stereotypes and stuff like that, the French called any African soldier who fought for the French Senegalese. So when we talk about the Senegalese tirailleurs, they actually weren't all from Senegal. A lot of them were, but a lot of them were not. In all, there were about 200,000 who fought in World War I. And as we get into World War II, there's actually even more who fought during that conflict. And about 30,000 Senegalese never returned home. And another kind of big part of the story is there were a lot of people in Senegal who actually did sign up for this conflict. But there are also a lot who were basically threatened to go to war. The French would go into different towns and say, hey, if this town doesn't give up like a certain amount of soldiers, we're going to take the land from the town. So there was some like what's called conscription going on. So people being forced to go fight in a conflict. But once they actually got to Europe, the tirailleurs played a huge role in the conflict. Every single battle that the French were in, there were Senegalese tirailleurs in that battle. On top of that, there were also soldiers from other colonies that were controlled by France, such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and other parts of the world too, who were actually fighting alongside them. And one of the things that's kind of some of the pictures I included are actually in color. At this time period, color photography was not a thing, but there's actually a whole profession where if you're really into history, really into art, really into fashion too, there's a job where people just kind of color in historical photos using different sources to try to tell about what were the colors like, what were the different kind of environments like in these pictures. So if you're really kind of into art or history or even just like fashion, this could be kind of an interesting profession to kind of examine a little bit. And another thing that happened when the tirailleurs got to Europe was they also had to not just deal with like fighting on the battlefield, they actually had to deal with racist French attitudes. Because of this racism that happened and that was kind of happening at this time, the French generals saw the tirailleurs as like expendable. So they're like, we're going to put them in the worst place where there's going to be the heaviest fighting. So this was something that really impacted the kind of experience of those soldiers. Yeah. Yeah, there's kind of the issue here. Like they're saying, hey, like these are not French soldiers, so we're just going to put them in places where they don't want the French soldiers to be. So there's this really, honestly, really kind of like a racist system. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point, especially like in the beginning of the war when they were using like really old tactics. They would put like those soldiers in the front and they would just get killed. And yeah, that was something that they had to kind of like adapt to with like the new tactics. That's a good point. Yeah. And Yeah, and as we kind of will look at World War II, they were in World War II as well. So this was an experience for hundreds of thousands of soldiers, primarily from Senegal, but from other parts of Western Africa as well. And just some more like photos that were like colored in later on too. That really kind of shows kind of like what it was like to be a soldier. And even today in Senegal and in France, there's a lot of monuments to the Tauliers. On the left here is a statue in Dakar, which is the capital of Senegal. And they have a statue kind of commemorating the experiences. And on the right, we do have a kind of like graveyard where there is like soldiers who are buried during a battle. And if you look kind of in the middle down here, it has a list of soldiers not from France who were fighting for France during this battle, including almost 1,000 Senegalese. So when we look at World War I, we often kind of think about European armies fighting each other, but it wasn't just European armies. There were people from all over the world who were fighting in this conflict. It wasn't just the Senegalese and people from Western Africa who were fighting in this too. There are also a lot of Vietnamese and South Asian and Southeast Asian soldiers and workers who are fighting in this conflict as well. Because of the war like draft that was going on, almost all the men of France were sent to fight in this war. So they needed people to go work in the factories. As we're going to look at next, a lot of women ended up working in the factories, but there are also thousands and thousands of people from the various colonies who went to France to go work in the factories as well, especially from Vietnam. I believe it ended up being something like 50 or 60,000 Vietnamese people moved to France to work in these factories during this war. And thinking back to the Industrial Revolution, because that time period still overlaps World War I, what were these factories like? What was it like to work in a factory at this time period? Yeah, it was really dangerous. The conditions were horrible. And on top of that, the pay was really bad. The hours were really long. The average workday today is like 8 hours. Back then, it was like 10 to 14. So you would spend almost your entire day in these dangerous and dirty conditions building weapons. So your conditions were even more dangerous than the normal factory workers. And something that was really important to the Vietnamese experience in these factories was they got to experience different things like organized labor. So there were French workers who were striking for better conditions in these factories. And the Vietnamese workers were seeing this and were saying, hey, if the people are able to kind of get this power and able to stand up for themselves, we can go back home and use what we learned to stand up for ourselves against the French Empire. And as we start to get into post-World War II later on this year, we're going to be exploring something called decolonization, where different countries that were colonized started breaking off from the empires. And a lot of the leaders of the early Vietnamese independence movements were workers in these factories during World War I. A lot of them were also soldiers in World War I too. So when we talk about World War I and its effects, it's not just affecting Europe. It's going to play a huge role in the events that actually happen really up until today. And again, this also goes to show that World War I was a global conflict. In our media and our history and our schools and stuff too, we often focus just on the European perspective and experience, but it's definitely not the only one. And here's some pictures of, on the left, we have Vietnamese workers in a munitions factory. So they're making some of the shells that would be used for the artillery. And on the right, there were Vietnamese units who were fighting in the war too. Another really big perspective that's sometimes lost in our discussions about World War I, but even just like war in general, is women in conflict. How did women play a really big role in this war? Yeah, there were a lot of nurses, definitely. Yeah, actually, yeah, when it comes to war, usually, at least in this time period, usually it was like men who'd go and fight. So what would the women do? How could they support the war effort? Yeah, working. That was really one of the really big things. Um, since there wasn't a lot of like people to work or a lot of since there weren't like a lot of men to work in the factories, a lot of women went into work to kind of take over those roles during the war. So much so that by the end of the war, about 50%, so half of the women in Europe were actually working in factories. So this was something that was a huge experience for women during this conflict, during this like time period. Um, to kind of like show how big of an impact women in the factories were, the British Army, 80% of all of their weapons were made by women. So this war would have been like impossible without um, women working in these factories. But as Ryan pointed out, they were also working as nurses, doctors, and communication officers too. So they were the people who would run the telegrams and other communication lines that were needed to communicate between different groups of people. In some cases, women actually fought in the battles too. Russia probably had the biggest percentage of women fighters. They actually had a battalion, so like thousands of women in this battalion called the Women's Battalion of Death, that became notorious for being like really good at fighting the Austrians. On the Western Front, too, there was also a woman named Edith Cavell who was a nurse, but she was helping evacuate prisoners of war and people who were wounded. And she got captured and actually got executed for helping people or helping like save people. So women's contributions to World War I are immense. On the left here, we have a statue in Brussels, Belgium, where Edith Cavell was stationed. So they have a statue to kind of her and her like kind of sacrifice for saving people. In the middle, we have a woman actually building airplanes. So when we talk about like working in the factories, it wasn't just like assembly lines and stuff. They were actually like building ships, building airplanes, doing a lot of really all the work that's kind of needed. And on the right here, we have oh gosh, I know I'm going to mispronounce this, but it is Maria Bakareva, who was the leader of like the Russians' Women's Battalion of Death. So she was highly decorated for her bravery during actual like fighting in the trenches. Oh, oops. Yeah. So in addition to that, we've been kind of focused a little bit on like the French kind of perspective still. So people from Senegal and West Africa, people from Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia, a lot of them went and fought for the French side. But there are also international troops for the British, for the Russians a little bit, as well as for like the Germans even. So we're going to be kind of looking at the experience of Indian soldiers during this war too. India was colonized by the British at this time period, so pretty much all the soldiers from India who were sent to fight ended up fighting for the British, and the British controlled trenches and other places. And something that's really, really important to keep in mind about kind of the Indian experience during this war is that there were more Indian soldiers in the conflict than American soldiers once America enters the war. So they are a really huge aspect of World War I and kind of understanding the experiences of that conflict. So we're going to watch a short interview with a man whose father was one of the Indian soldiers who fought in the conflict and was really one of the most highly decorated soldiers of the war. And he's going to kind of talk to you about like his experiences and what were some of the things that happened with him during the war and after the war too. So I think I need to fix the setting real quick.
You know, those days it was a trench warfare. War was face to face. There was a trench which was occupied by Germans. My father was the section commander at that time, that is a Naik. On the night of 23rd, 24th November 1914, he led the attack and injured about 7 to 8 or killed about 7 to 8 Germans. He was severely injured on his head, on his arm, and he was profusely bleeding. But he said that so long the trench is not fully captured, I will not leave the position. And he was awarded the Victoria Cross by King George V. Here it is written, for valor, for valor. Till First World War, people have no much idea about as to what is the gravity of the war. He was so much affected by the devastation of the war, possibly losing his friends right in front of him. It is not a good thing to kill another person. Possibly he himself benefited so many people, which was for someone else's sake. And he never wanted war things to be repeated. He had 2-3 guns. He never went for hunting. He said that killing killing a bird is, one should not kill anything. He realized that you can survive so long the God's hand is on you. He was absolutely illiterate when he joined the army. He used to say that we are far, far behind than what those people are. So backward, where people in our area even didn't see a vehicle. His outlook changed. He saw the world. In fact, the life of the people of our area was just like a frog in the well. But after visiting all over Europe and fighting in the war and seeing how the world is progressing, his outlook changed. And his basic change was that there should be more education, one should live well. King George himself definitely asked him that, what do you want? He said that in my area there is no school. Our children are absolutely illiterate. So in case a educational institution could be established in a place like Karan. And sure enough, within a year or so, a middle school was established at Karan. That is a very wrong impression some people have got, that Indian troops who fought in the First World War and Second World War, they fought for a different country. I entirely do not agree with it. They fought for the Indian nation that time.
So, oops, let me fix that. As we can kind of see there, even though that was just one soldier's experience, this was an experience that was shared by really like hundreds of thousands of soldiers from India, as well as from other parts of the world too. When it comes to this conflict, it's really, really important to understand that it's affecting everywhere. Not just in terms of the actual like war and stuff like that, but even afterwards. Just like with kind of like the Vietnamese workers, where a lot of them ended up leading a lot of independence efforts. The same thing is going to happen with India's independence movement. A lot of the early leaders of India's independence movement against the British learned a lot of things when they were fighting in World War I, when they were interacting with people from other parts of the world. So the effects of World War I are going to really affect pretty much every place on the planet. And I'm just going to turn the lights on just so that everyone here is able to see. So prepare your eyes. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, the very last kind of perspective that we're going to be exploring, and again, this is definitely not the only like 5 other perspectives that are out there. There's a lot. Is the Arab Revolt of 1916. So during the conflict, most of the battles were in Europe, but a lot of them were in the Middle East as well. And in order to understand that, we're just a very brief thing we have to kind of understand about the Middle East at the time. Since about the mid 1400s, so the time period in which we kind of start our whole class, much of what's now the Middle East was controlled by a country called the Ottoman Empire. They kind of controlled everything, and they were a lot bigger than what it kind of shows on this map. But by World War I, they were kind of falling apart. A lot of their lands were taken over by other places. Some areas of their country just kind of broke off. And they tried to reform their country to try to like modernize. And one of these modernizations was some laws that would basically give ethnic Turkish people a lot more rights and privileges than a lot of the other people who were living in the Ottoman Empire at the time. So these would be people like Armenians and Arabs and Kurdish people, and even like some like European ethnicities as well. And when these laws started to first kind of come around, there were groups, especially in what's now Saudi Arabia, so all the way down here, who were saying, let's break off from this empire that's dying, just form our own countries. And in World War I, since the Ottoman Empire was on the German and Austrian side, they decided this is a good time to try to rebel. We can get supplies and weapons and training from the British. And that's kind of what they did. So over 2 years, there's this huge, really quick campaign that liberated huge areas of what's going to become the Middle East from the Ottoman Empire. And one of the big, there's Mel. One of the really big consequences of this part of World War I and this part of the world is that a lot of the conflict that we see in the Middle East today has its roots in World War I. After the war, there was a secret agreement between the British and the French. They decided that we're not going to let these different ethnic groups to have their own countries. We're going to take it over for ourselves. So they drew lines in the Middle East, splitting up areas controlled by France, controlled by England. And a lot of these problems or a lot of these kind of like divisions are causing problems still today. So this is going to be something that we are going to come back to once we get into post-World War II. So just kind of keep a little pin in that agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But we're going to come back to that. And just kind of wrap up today, there are some pictures from this conflict. So this was, So how, like, what would you how this put from probably like this last part, so like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, since that is going to play like a really big kind of role in what's going to happen in the region for the future. But basically, kind of like a quick preview, the lines that are set up by this agreement actually are the same borders that the countries of the Middle East have today. And those borders do cause a lot of conflict. But just to kind of sum up today, hopefully you guys kind of saw just a few different perspectives that are often missing from our understandings of World War I. And the reason why we kind of looked at these is it's really important to understand as many perspectives as we can. When we just look at one story, we're kind of missing the whole history. So hopefully you guys kind of had a little bit of a chance to kind of see that today. But just to wrap up, the last kind of activity that we're going to be doing is trying to look at this question. What other historical perspectives might be missing from the way that we teach or look at and understand history? So for this, you're going to pretend that you are a Hollywood producer tasked with coming up with an idea for a based on a true story historical movie. This movie doesn't have to be about World War I. It can be about any historical event or person or movement or anything like that that you find interesting that is sometimes not really well focused on. So you're going to create this movie based on a historical perspective that sometimes isn't focused on. Oh, yeah, that's totally fine. And this can be something that really isn't focused on in media or in school or maybe somewhere else. And again, this perspective does not have to be about World War I. It can be about any time period. And this could be something that maybe you'll already know about. Maybe there's a part of history that you haven't really seen a whole lot of movies or teachers cover a whole lot that you do like. And that could be like a way to kind of look at this. Or maybe you might want to do a little bit of research and see, are there any interesting stories that should be told that really haven't been? So what you're going to be doing is once you're going to have that idea, you're going to post it into a Padlet. I'm just going to go over again later on kind of how to use Padlet. But there's 3 questions that you're going to answer in your post. What was that event? Kind of describe what the event was or the person that you want that movie to be made about. The second thing is, what is the missing perspective that you want to be explored in this movie? So specifically, what perspective is missing here that shouldn't be missing? And finally, why do you think that perspective is often left out when it comes to understanding that historical events or that time period in history? And the reason why we're doing it in a Padlet is just so that way you guys can kind of check out and see what other people kind of chose for theirs. So I'll show you how to actually post it. So if you go to Moodle, I'll make a new tab. Then if you go to our page, you're going to click on the link that says 3 red Padlet. And it looks like there's a couple other, cool, so a couple people got started, so that's awesome. Yeah, you're going to be basically kind of doing what is already being done so far. You're just going to kind of post in here what your answers to those 3 questions. Just make sure to include your name as well. There isn't like a grade for this in Moodle, but it is in PowerSchool. So this will be for a participation grade. For those of you who may have forgot or may be new to Padlet, what you're going to do is when you open this link, it's going to ask you to either sign in or sign up. If you have signed in before, so if you've used Padlet before, you can just sign in using your school account by clicking on the little circle at the top. If you are new, what you can do is just sign up with your school account. It's going to be completely free, and it should give you access to this Padlet. But yeah, basically after you post yours, just kind of check out other people's and kind of see what they chose. Because it's kind of a cool way to kind of learn about things that maybe aren't covered a whole lot. I'm going to stop the share here, though. Are there any questions on what to do next? Okay. All right. Well, if there are no questions, for those of you guys on Zoom, you guys are free to go and work on this. If you have any questions, though, feel free to stay and I can help out. But yeah, I guess I will see you guys next week. See you, everyone.